أهلا فيك رامي، يعطيك ألف عافية. كيفك اليوم؟
الحمد لله، الله يخليك. نسأل عنك إن شاء الله. تمام.
كتر خير الله. مساء الخير لكل المستمعين، ومساء الخير لضيفتنا لليوم المحامية ماريا بانشينكو، اختصاصية في family law, criminal law, some traffic violations, drunk driving, landlord tenant وبعض الأمور الأخرى. Good afternoon, Attorney Maria Panchenko.
Good afternoon, Joumana. Good afternoon, Rami.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. All right. So today, Maria, we want to talk about a number of things. And one of them is, though not necessarily in that order, when you acquire property here during a marriage and you are getting divorced, we have had a scenario of many people over the months and the years calling us whose family relatives in the home country, whether it be Iraq or Lebanon. We even had a case in other countries, in the Philippines and so forth. Some of those scenarios are such that a family relative gives them money to invest here in the United States, and the money is put into the person who is now divorcing. The other person divorcing them wants half of that. We're going to also talk about the flip. What if it is a gift during the marriage? The flip side of that is, what if you have property overseas, like in Lebanon or Iraq, and you are going through a marriage? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a number of calls that we're getting from other states, because a number of people listen to us from outside of Michigan, how we handle these calls, at least within the context of family law and criminal law. If we have time, we're going to talk about a lot of calls that we are getting from victims of a crime. So they do not need representation because they are accused of a crime, or they may be accused of a crime. They are rather the victim of a crime, and they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know who will advocate on their behalf, and so forth. And we're going to start first with a very a huge influx, a big trend happening in our office has been a couple of weeks mostly, where we are getting, sadly, a huge influx of divorce calls lately. Tell us about those, and tell us what do you think the reason is why lately we have been getting a lot of divorce calls.
Well, we had talked recently about the National Divorce Day and how the beginning of the year really does bring a lot of new divorces in the state and across the country. I believe that is definitely a contributing factor, but you're right. In the last 2 weeks, we've really seen an increase in demand for divorce attorneys in our office. Lots of calls coming in, people wanting to file for divorce. And I believe that there could be a multitude of different reasons, but
the first of which is the stimulus checks.
The stimulus checks. And that's what I was just going to say, Joumana. We talked about this before, that, people are suffering financially in this country right now, and definitely in the state of Michigan. And the stimulus money has come through. The CARES Act has gone through round 2 now. Very recently, people have received stimulus checks to help, their financial stress, as well as the unemployment being extended and supplemented again for a second time. And I think that those changes in the last couple of weeks have made it financially possible for people who have been contemplating divorce, but perhaps were unable to financially, swing it for, their family and their financial circumstances, have suddenly been able to come up with some kind of money or got the extra boost they needed for their savings to be able to file for divorce that probably was pending in their minds anyway, that they've been thinking about filing and just didn't have the financial resources to do so.
Okay, so you believe that one of the major reasons for why many more people are calling us wanting to divorce is because they have a little bit of financial reprieve, because a number of people who called us have received their stimulus checks. And again, if you are a couple, it's $1,200, and if you have qualifying children, it's an extra $600 per child. Also, to those who are on unemployment, the $600 of additional federal aid is now $300, and that's better than that time period where the federal funds had stopped and they were only limited to the state unemployment. This discussion is not about the stimulus check, and this is not about unemployment. We're only mentioning it to say that it has encouraged a number of people who were in very precarious relationships to now call and be ready to move on, sadly, with their divorces. Another reason you did say, and we talked about that maybe about a month ago, is a lot of people who are contemplating divorce prefer to wait until after the holidays. They don't want to put their children and their families through the news of divorce. So they it's now after the holidays, and so that's another reason. You mentioned to me something very interesting. And yes, it's not like people are telling you we're getting divorced because of that, but you're hearing it and you have been hearing it. You did say to me that this election has been stressful for a lot of couples because you often find people within the same family, whether it's between the couple or whether between the couple and their extended families, who are arguing over political views, who disagree. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, there's always been an undertone, of course, that people have varying views. And you'd think most people they marry people that have similar or substantially similar views of their own, but people change and things change. And this election in particular has been extremely difficult on the entire country. There's been a lot of divisiveness, and it's not just between political parties; it's happening inside of families. And, I have been hearing different things when we go through the divorce process and when we start, the divorce process, and they ask me, well, is this important? Is that important? And that different hot button topics that have been a very big point of contention in the election have come up, and people are curious if that is impactful of their divorce or their custody issues, and so that leads me to believe that a lot of people, maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, or another factor that contributed to them making the call to start the divorce, resulted from a debate or an argument that was politically involved, and it can happen because too it can start problems between extended family members, which ultimately cause problems inside the marriage. And so this has been a very strange year between the election and the COVID and everything going on. There's a lot of stressors that are adding on to families that if they didn't have enough stress or they weren't undergoing stress, uh, enough stress as it was, these are just additional things that are causing, uh, people who are maybe on the brink of divorce to take the step over that line and start filing.
Because unlike in previous years, we have seen political disagreements between people rise to the level of hate and crime and all of that. And that,
Yes.
so people have disagreed all the time. I'll always remember the case of when President Bill Clinton, then Governor Bill Clinton, was running for president the first time, and then again at the second time. One of his main advisors, James Carville, who coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," that we believe, everybody believes, got President Bill Clinton to be elected, was a staunch Democrat. His wife, Mary Matalin, was a staunch Republican, and she was advising then President George Bush Sr., number 42, and they debated each other all day long. They appeared on CNN and whatever, and they went home and they were a loving couple. These were the old days. In these days, especially the past few years, political views have become very, very heated, and it's not amicable anymore. It's not we can agree to disagree and be friends and go home. So I can see how political tensions within families can really contribute to the division of and the erosion of that family relationship. It isn't what it used to be. It used to be that you can agree to disagree and have different political views and be friends. And now we have seen that it can rise to violence, and it can rise to hatred, and it can rise to crime. We've seen it.
Yeah, and I'm seeing it more and more. It's really touching families, even if you have the same views. The families are it's just the stress, the environment that we're all living under right now. It's just another factor to add to on its own. It's another factor to add to the stress on a marriage, and everybody's in a very big state of tension. It just walking around, you can feel it in the environment, and it just doesn't help an already struggling marriage.
Right, correct. We're going to take a quick break, and before we take our first break, I'm just going to translate very quickly in Arabic. عم بتخبرنا المحامية ماريا بانشينكو إنه آخر أسبوعين بالتحديد إجينا عدد اتصالات غير طبيعي من قبل أشخاص للأسف عم بيفكروا أو بدهم يقدموا طلاقهم. تعتبر هي السبب الأساسي هو لأنه في كتير أشخاص حصلوا على الستيمولس تشيك. الموضوع اليوم هو مش عن ستيمولس تشيك، بس نذكر انه في كتير اشخاص حصلوا على الستيمولس تشيكس تبعهم وصار عندهم مصاري، وفي منهم كمان على unemployment، ولانه هلا زادوا الفدرال unemployment ل $300، كان $600، بعدين انتهى بأغسطس، بعدين زادوه هلا ل $300. يعني العالم عم بتبلش ترتاح شوي، يمكن كلمة ترتاح مش مزبوطة، بس ترتاح أكتر من قبل ماديا. والأشخاص اللي ما بقى عم يقدروا يتحملوا السيتويشن تبعهم عم بيتصلوا فينا وعم بيفكروا يقدموا طلاق. السبب الثاني هو انه مرقوا الاعياد، واجمالا قبل الاعياد في كثير اشخاص ما بيحبوا يمشوا بالطلاق من بعد الاعياد. وفي سبب ثالث ذكرته، هو كان في كثير تعصيب وكان في كتير تنشن شفتها، وهي بتحكي لأنه عندها خبرة بالموضوع وعندها خبرة من تجربة خاصة. والتجربة الخاصة هي أنه بتتلقى كل هؤلاء الاتصالات وقت اللي بتتكلم مع الأشخاص اللي عم بيفكروا يقدموا طلاقهم، وبتسألهم عن الأسباب اللي وصلتهم لهون. عم تسمع شغلة عم تتردد اللي ما كنا نسمع فيها قبل، اللي هي أنه الوضع بالإضافة للوضع الاقتصادي، وضع الوباء اللي هو منه مبشر لأي إنسان، اللي عامل إحباط لكتير عالم، ما بيقدروا يسافروا، ما بيقدروا ينبسطوا، ما عندهم شيء to look forward to. بالإضافة الوضع السياسي، في كتير أوقات تنشن بين الرجل والامرأة أو بين الكابل والعائلة تبعه. وذكرت هون كيف اختلف، وكمان نحن هون مش عم نحكي سياسي، عم نعطي example. اختلف الظروف، الوضع السياسي اليوم مختلف جدا عن من 15 سنة. من 15 سنة وقت اللي الجوفرنر بيل كلينتون كان بده مترشح على رئاسة الجمهورية، من المستشارين تبعه اللي يعتبر هو جيمس كارفل، يمكن هو كان سبب انه قدر نجح اول مرة رئيس الجمهورية بيل كلينتون، لانه هو اللي ساعده to coin the phrase it's the economy stupid. ورئيس بيل كلينتون نزل بهيدا السلوغن وربح من وراها الاقتصاد الاقتصاد الاقتصاد. جيمس كارفل كان بهديك الأيام بعلاقة، هلأ متزوجين ومبسوطين كتير مع بعضهم، كان بعلاقة مع سيدة اسمها ماري ماتلن. ماري ماتلن هي كانت مستشارة جورج بوش الأب رقم 42، رئيس الجمهورية رقم 42 جورج بوش الأب، وكانوا يتخانقوا مع بعضهم all day long. هي تعطي استشاراتها لجورج بوش، وهو لبيل كلينتون، وهو عم بيحارب تيتا نيل ليربح بيل كلينتون، وبالفعل بيل كلينتون ربح، وكانوا يروحوا على البيت وكانوا بأحسن حالاتهم، وبعدين تجوزوا وهلأ صار عندهم ولد، وعلاقتهم صار لها أكثر من 20 سنة. هيدي الأيام القديمة. هيدي الأيام الجديدة هلأ للأسف اللي عم بيصير، الظروف السياسية اللي عم بتصير في الولايات المتحدة، رامي عم بتذكرني بالظروف السياسية اللي موجودة بلبنان ويمكن بالعراق ويمكن بسوريا، بيقتلوا بعضهم كل واحد مع مين وكل واحد مع أي حزب، وبيصير في كره وبيصير في عدم كلام بين العيال. عم نشوفها عم بتصير. عم بتقلنا المحامية ماريا بانشينكو إنه وقت اللي بتتكلم مع الأشخاص اللي عم يتصلوا فينا، عم تسمع انه العدم التوافق بالافكار السياسيه هي من العوامل، يمكن هي مش العامل الاساسي او العامل الاول، بس من العوامل اللي عم تسمع الاشخاص اللي عم بيتصلوا فينا عم بيتذمروا عنا. هيدي شغله ما كنا نسمع فيها قبل، عم نسمع فيها وهي ريفلكتيف اوف ذا مود اللي موجود بكل الولايات المتحده. للاسف الاتصالات عم بتزيد كتير، اولا لانه ستيمولس تشيك صارت موجوده وعم توصل للاشخاص، ومن بعد الهوليديز والإلكشن مود كمان عم بيسبب كتير ستريس بالعلاقات. خلينا ناخد وقفة سريعة، ومن بعدها بدنا نتكلم عن اتصالات عم تجينا من غير ولايات بطريقة سريعة.
مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز تتمنى لكم السلامة في ظل انتشار وباء كوفيد-19. المحامية جومانا كيروز مثلت على مدى 22 عاما ضحايا حوادث السيارات مع طاقم من المحامين ذوي الخبرة، وحصلت لموكليها على تعويضات بمئات الملايين من الدولارات. قبل أن تختار المحامي الذي سيدافع عن قضيتك، دقق في تاريخه المهني. ومع مكاتب جومانا كيروز ستنذهل بآراء مئات الموكلين وخبراتهم الإيجابية في جوجل ريفيوز. مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يتحدثون لغتك العربية والكلدانية. 248-557-3645 والاستشارة مجانية. مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يبحث عن موظف يتولى مهام الترجمة من الإنجليزية إلى العربية والعكس، لمساعدة الموكلين في التواصل مع المحامين. على المتقدم أو المتقدمة لشغل هذه الوظيفة أن يجيد اللغتين العربية والإنجليزية بطلاقة، والخبرة غير ضرورية. الوظيفة بدوام كامل 5 أيام في الأسبوع. للراغبين بشغل هذه الوظيفة الاتصال بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز على الرقم 248-557-3645 248-557-3645. Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. عودة مع المحامية جومانا كيروز في برنامج Your Rights. للمشاركة في البرنامج وحلقة اليوم بإمكانكم الاتصال على الأرقام 313-769-6666 519-256-1023 وعلى الواتساب 313-327-7074. بالإضافة إلى رقم المكتب بالتأكيد بإمكانكم الحصول على استشارات مجانية في قضايا الإصابات الشخصية، من ضمنها حوادث السيارات، إصابات العمل، الأخطاء الطبية، قضايا الهجرة والتجنس، الإفلاس، الضمان الاجتماعي وقوانين العائلة. والرقم هو 248-557-3645. جمانة نرجع لك.
شكرا رامي. And we are back with attorney Maria Panchenko, specialist in family law and criminal law. Every Tuesday we talk about family law and criminal law. Attorney Maria Panchenko, we are blessed to have a lot of listeners listen to us from other states here in the United States. And as a result, we get requests for consultations from people who reside in other states, whether they are calling for a family dispute or whether they are calling for a criminal matter. How do you, very briefly, how do you deal? Are you able to help such people? And if not, what do you do?
Well, depending on what they're calling about, I do my best to always make sure there's nothing I can do to help them. But for the most part,
the laws, because criminal laws, I'm sorry to interrupt, and family laws, they vary. They may be very similar. However, they vary from one state to the other because they are state laws. They are not federal laws, correct?
Correct. And I'm also only licensed to practice law in the state of Michigan, where our office is. And, I can't give legal advice about a issue that's happening in, let's say, Nevada or California, because of the fact that, like you said, the laws may be different, and I'm not practicing in that state, so I'm not aware of the laws in that state and how they might be different from our own. So and I also cannot assist in the court system there because I'm not licensed to practice there. I'm not admitted into their state's court. So I do my best to assess the situation when we do get callers from out of state, and see if I can help them find somebody that can help them in their state locally, based on their issue. But for the most part, I'm unable to assist because of the fact that my license is limited to the state of Michigan.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you at all tell them, if it were a Michigan case, here is what the law is, and then you tell them, The laws in your state may be very similar, but they may be different too, or no?
Yes, all the time. And I always advise that they should contact an attorney that is licensed in their state to verify the differences, if any, and how it would be handled in their state courts.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to move on to one of the big things we wanted to discuss today, which is coming into property during the marriage. What will happen to that property if you get divorced? First off, let's talk about two or three different scenarios. Let's change the facts a little bit. We had a lady who is of Lebanese origin come to us for a divorce. And the problem is that she has some things in her name here that aren't truly hers. Her sister in Lebanon gave her the money to purchase property here in Michigan. Now she is going through a divorce, and her husband wants half of that.
Yes, and when in this situation, when the money was given to the client from her sister overseas, the property was purchased in the client's name, which is it's difficult to assess what to do here because you have a situation when you're going through divorce where anything that you've acquired during the course of your marriage is considered marital property. So if you buy a home and you're buying a home in your name and you're doing it while you're married and then ultimately go through a divorce and this property is still in your name, it's considered a marital asset. It's presumed to be owned by both you and your spouse as far as the divorce is concerned, and it needs to be equally split.
Unless you are able to offer proof that it's
You
not
would
a
have,
marital asset.
yes, you would need to convince a judge with a lot of evidence, very well documented, and probably testimony that this property was never your property and that it's in your name for the reason that the person overseas gave you this money to invest on their behalf. It will be a very difficult argument because it's one that why not just put it in your sister's name if it's her property? And that will be a question
And
you'll have
why
to answer.
right, and why didn't the sister in Lebanon put the property here in her name? We're talking about the sister in Lebanon. Why didn't she put in her own name? Why did she put in her sister's name? I think that anybody can purchase property in the United States. You don't have to be a US citizen or have a social security or be a green card holder. So anyone in Lebanon right now who has the money can buy property here in the United States. Why didn't that sister do it that way?
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. It would have been much better. I mean, obviously, nobody goes into those types of things thinking, oh, well, if I get divorced, this is going to be a real problem for me. That's not usually on somebody's mind. But when you're dealing with family specifically, there's a lot of trust, and it's kind of like, I'm going to buy this property, I'm going to give you the money, go buy me a house. And it's kind of very informal, and they don't have the access or knowledge or expertise in how this could affect them legally speaking, or in the event of a divorce that they might have not been contemplating at the time. And so it's kind of just an informal process between sisters, and nobody thought, oh gosh, this could really affect me in the future. And it really is important for people to consider all of the possibilities when buying property for someone else, because truly, especially if that person's married, you're creating a situation that if that marriage ends in divorce, that you might lose your property that you invested in. And it's especially between family because, as we just said, Joumana, it has to be well documented. You need to offer proof, but it's going to be very difficult to prove to a judge that this wasn't just a gift, because people just don't talk, in a legal documented way when they're dealing with family. They're just talking over the phone, and it's very casual. So I'm glad that you brought this up on the radio today to inform listeners to keep this in mind.
Correct. Now, if the sister in Lebanon had gifted that money to her sister here, the divorcing husband is entitled to half of that gift because now it's a marital asset, correct?
Yes, if she gifted a money or to of any kind, and it goes into, you've come into property now, during the course of your marriage,
Or cash, or
or
cash.
cash, it's going to be difficult to claim that that's separate property, especially if you live your life in a way that all the rest of your assets are joint. If you get money and you put it into your bank account, and then go and buy a house, it's half of that equity is going to go to your spouse.
What if during the marriage you have inherited money or property? Should a divorce happen, is half of that inheritance the divorcing spouse's property?
This specific scenario is going to be much different, and inheritance is got its own protection, and it's not
Okay.
part of your marital estate unless you commingle it.
Unless you get the money from the inheritance, you put it in your joint bank account, you start using from it, using it for this. You don't want to do that. If you inherit during the marriage and you want to keep it separate in the event of a divorce, you have to put it in a separate bank account and not commingle that money with your husband wife money, correct? Could you be
Correct.
commingling it in any other way? Could you be commingling an inheritance? Let's say it's not, let's say it's not, it's a piece of land. How can you commingle a piece of land that you inherited?
Right. If you inherit.
If you take money out of your bank account and improve the property or refinance it or something like that, right?
Yes, if you come into a piece of property or a home or something like that in an inheritance, it would be separate unless you do one of the things that you just mentioned. You take from your joint marital bank account and you improve the property with marital funds. There's going to be some kind of an offset of how much value did your marital estate contribute to the increase in value of that property, and they're going to look at that and figure out how much of this is going to be a part of the marital estate. If it's refinanced, the property, you take a mortgage out and you utilize spouses, you utilize your spouse's income and put them on that mortgage, and now you've completely commingled the property and it's become a marital asset. And the other example that you gave, which was putting in putting it in a deed, deeding it over to yourself as a married person and putting your spouse on the deed if you choose not to, basically put money into it, but you've deeded the property to yourself as a married person with your spouse. These kinds of things take it out of the realm of inheritance and put it back into the marital estate.
Okay, so to our listeners, if you get an inheritance during your marriage and you do it right, that inheritance will be protected in the event of a divorce. However, because inheritance laws have special protection. However, if you do not follow the rules and you commingle the inheritance money or the inheritance property with your own joint marital estate, then you lose that protection. Then it becomes in whole or in part, subject to being divided equally during the marriage. The kind of protection an inheritance has is not offered to a gift during the marriage. What about things you have before the marriage? So let's say you had a property before the marriage. Does that become joint property during the marriage?
Generally speaking, it would stay separate property, but
Unless you
again,
commingle it.
correct. It's going to have those same stipulations. If you start commingling any kind of money or property or retirement or any kind of asset that you have into your marital estate, now you have opened the door for it to become divided, as you said perfectly, in whole or in part, at least, to the marital estate.
Okay, let's talk about the example of a Filipino client that you represented, whose husband, you were representing the wife, and the husband had property back home in the Philippines. Was the wife, first of all, when did he acquire that property? Was it commingled or was it during the marriage? What did the judge here say about the property back in the Philippines? And can your client, the Filipina client here, touch any of that money from the property in the Philippines?
Yeah, so this was interesting because he owned property before the marriage, and
You were representing the wife
yes, and
in a divorce here in Michigan.
yes, and
Okay.
the husband had owned property before the marriage, and he
Okay,
had
so let me interrupt you for a minute. Are we talking about the property before the marriage because he commingled it during the marriage?
he did
He did. How
he
did he do that?
well, he ended up selling off it. So he owned land, which is very common overseas. Just no home on the property, just land. And he owned several plots of land before the marriage. During the marriage, he sold parcels of his property and he bought new property with the money he had earned from the sale of the property he owned before.
How was that commingling?
Well, because what he had done was he came into property during the course of his marriage
As
and
well, I see.
yes, he utilized money that should or property and that became liquid money when he sold it during the course of his marriage, and then went and acquired more property by thereby commingling the assets, and of course the property that was new during the marriage that became marital property. And what he really did that kind of made it solid for the court that it was commingled was when he got the money from the property that he sold, he put it in his joint marital bank account and then took it and utilized joint marital funds to purchase more property.
Additional property. In what county was this case filed?
This case was a Macomb County case.
Okay. And what did the court say as far as your client's right, the wife's right, to half of the property that exists back in the Philippines?
Ultimately, there was a judgment that gave her equal share of the properties that were purchased.
Still are in the Philippines.
Yes, still in the Philippines. So the order was either he had to pay her the amount of the equity, or they had to sell the property and split the equity. So they had elected to sell the property. However, he was non-cooperative.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. So the court here in Macomb County ordered him to sell property back in the Philippines and give half of the proceeds to his wife.
Yes.
That's the Macomb County court order.
Yes, that's his, yes.
However, he did not comply.
No, he did not. And we had to go back to court several times to try to enforce compliance on motions, to enforce the judgment. And ultimately, after several times back to court, the judge ordered that our client, the wife, go and get the property appraised, essentially. How much is the property worth? And we came back to court after the appraisal was done, and the judge modified the order by basically telling him this is how much the property is worth according to the appraisal. Therefore, since you refuse to comply with the order to sell and get it going, you owe her this much, which was 50% of the appraised value. And he ended up having to pay her that amount in a cash, not settlement, a cash order for cash judgment.
So in other words, a court here in the United States, very specifically in Macomb County, was able to order the husband to pay the wife for half the value of property that exists in the Philippines.
Yes.
Now, if the wife took the order from here, from the Macomb County, and took it to the Philippines, we don't know if the Philippine court would have enforced that, correct?
Correct. There's no way of knowing if that would have been if the courts there would have taken the order to mean that they have to enforce the sale or anything along those lines.
Let's talk about another scenario that we've seen happen with our Middle Eastern clients who may get divorced back home and have an order of divorce and come here. Tell us about that.
But if they have an order,
And whether the
if they have a,
because let's be very clear, one country does not need to enforce the orders of another country. One court in one country is not obligated, but may want to, depending on the judge and the circumstances, to enforce the order of a judge in another country. So the country of the Philippines or the country of Lebanon or Iraq do not need to enforce the order of a judge here in Wayne County, Oakland County, Macomb County. They may do it, but they don't have to do it. The flip side is the same. If you have an order in the Philippines, if you have an order in Baghdad, if you're an order in Lebanon, and you bring it here, the court here may or may not adopt it into their order, correct?
That is possible. Where we see this happen a lot in the Middle Eastern community is if there is a Islamic marriage and there's an Islamic divorce overseas. However, a legal marriage is recognized here in the United States, and a legal divorce needs to be implemented with the state courts. In that situation,
so you have to open a claim here. You have to file a complaint for divorce here.
Correct, and get a legal divorce. And if you have a judgment of some kind from overseas or from a sheikh or something along these lines, that the court will consider these things when determining the equity of the matter. And if they find that it is equitable to divide the same way that they did overseas, then they will do that. Absolutely.
Okay. So a judge here may add to his or her order what the order of another court or another religious tribunal in another country stated, and make it part of the order here. So now it's an order here, it's an enforceable order here, and the divorcing spouse can seek her or his remedies accordingly.
Yes, if the court finds that the same order.
You have to convince them. You have to convince them
that it's still equitable, that it's fair, and that it applies here in the States, that it applies to this divorce case, and that you have property or whatever it is that you're arguing about, or whatever it is that you have a judgment. They will sometimes adopt the same ruling, so to speak, into their own judgment of divorce.
Okay, so by way of example, let's say a divorce happened in Lebanon, and the court orders the husband to pay his wife $20,000 for some property. The wife can come here and file for divorce here and show the judge and explain to the judge what another court in another country stated. And if she can convince the judge that she indeed is entitled to that, and the judge finds it fair, the judge in his order here will add that the husband is supposed to pay the wife $20,000.
Only if it's not a legal divorce in the other country. So if they're legally divorced in, I believe you said it was Baghdad, or if it was Lebanon, if you're legally divorced and then you come to the United States, you're not recognized in the United States as a married person. So you can't then go file for another divorce. So you would have, in these situations, is normally we come up with when it's an Islamic marriage and they get Islamically divorced, and there's a ruling from a sheikh, or there's a ruling from the mosque that says, they owe a certain amount of money back for dowry, or if there's something property wise that they've come to a judgment on, or we call it a judgment, but I think it's referred to more commonly as a ruling from the sheikh. That is something that once you come to the United States, if you're still considered a legally married person because you've never been legally divorced by a court of competent authority, that situation, you are entitled to a divorce on a legal grounds, and if you're recognized as a married person when you enter the United States.
So let me ask you, if a court of competent jurisdiction grants a divorce in Lebanon, then those parties, when they enter here, they're in the eyes of the law here divorced. How do they go about proving that? Do you just take the judgment of divorce from Lebanon and you have it certified by the Lebanese consulate that it's an authentic document, and that will be sufficient to be recognized or to be granted a divorce here? Which one is it?
Well, if you're legally divorced in Lebanon, let's say, when you enter the United States, you would enter as a single person. So the United States, and this would be a great question for Sam too. My understanding is when you enter the United States, let's say Michigan, you're coming to Michigan. Michigan would not recognize you as a married person, but rather a single person. So
there isn't anything for you to prove. You can get married again, and if anybody disputes that, you can show the judgment of divorce from Lebanon.
Yes, I believe so, and I do believe that that's part of the immigration process, that they try to figure out whether or not you're a married person or a single person.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, so I think that, but if you have a situation where you were granted a Lebanese divorce, for instance, and by a court of competent jurisdiction in Lebanon, and they ordered that you be awarded some type of property, and you want to enforce, it would be the same as if you did it here. You would have to go back to the court that did it and have them enforce it, just like we can you have orders here in the United States, and then if somebody goes back to home, let's say Lebanon, and they want the order enforced, they're not going to very well be able to get much success in the Lebanon court with their order. They would have to come back here and have it enforced, which is difficult to do. It's a difficult situation and scenario for people that go back and forth between countries. It's hard.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about one of our clients, an Iraqi client who had property, I believe in Canada, that, if I remember, he acquired before the marriage and did not want to share half of with his divorcing wife. I think he commingled it, or maybe bought it during the marriage. We'll get the details right after the break.
مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يبحث عن موظف يتولى مهام الترجمة من الإنجليزية إلى العربية والعكس لمساعدة الموكلين في التواصل مع المحامين. على المتقدم أو المتقدمة لشغل هذه الوظيفة أن يجيد اللغتين العربية والإنجليزية بطلاقة، والخبرة غير ضرورية. الوظيفة بدوام كامل 5 أيام في الأسبوع. للراغبين بشغل هذه الوظيفة الاتصال بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز على الرقم 248-557-3645 248-557-3645. مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز تتمنى لكم السلامة في ظل انتشار وباء كوفيد-19. المحامية جومانا كيروز مثلت على مدى 22 عاما ضحايا حوادث السيارات مع طاقم من المحامين ذوي الخبرة، وحصلت لموكليها على تعويضات بمئات الملايين من الدولارات. قبل أن تختار المحامي الذي سيدافع عن قضيتك، دقق في تاريخه المهني. ومع مكاتب جومانا كيروز ستنذهل بآراء مئات الموكلين وخبراتهم الإيجابية في جوجل ريفيوز. مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يتحدثون لغتك العربية والكلدانية. 248-557-3645 والاستشارة مجانية. Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. عودة إلى برنامج Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. رقم الهاتف في مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز هو 248-557-3645. للمشاركة على الهواء 313-769-6666 519-256-1023. نرجع لك جومانا.
شكرا رامي، وبنرجع مع المحامية ماريا بانشينكو. بس قبل ما نخلص معها بحب ترجم بطريقة سريعة. المعلومات اللي عم نعطيها شوي معقدة، لازم الإنسان يفكر بهالطريقة. أي شيء بيحصل عليه ضمن الزواج، إذا كان هدية أو إذا كان شيء الله وفقه فيه، إذا طلق النص له والنص للطرف الآخر. وإنما إذا ضمن الزواج الإنسان حصل على ورثة inheritance، في قوانين خاصة تعطي حصانة لهؤلاء الأشخاص، إلا إذا ما حملوا حالهم وخلطوا الانهيرتنس تبعهم، إن كانت مصاري حطوها بقلب الأكاونت تبع الزوجة أو الزوج، أو إذا حصلوا على property وبلشوا ياخدوا مصاري من الماريتال اكاونت لحتى يغيروا البروبرتي، ليحسنوها، ليبيعوها، ليعملوا ريفاينانسينج. يعني وقت الانسان بيمزج بطريقه او باخرى مصاري حصل عليها او ورثه حصل عليها ضمن الزواج، هذه الورثه صارت بالجزء او بالنص، النص لهم والنص للطرف الاخر عند الطلاق. كل أشياء بيجيبها الإنسان معه للزواج قبل ما يفوت على الزواج، حتى لو ما في بريناب أجريمنت، بالمبدأ بيترك فيها عند الطلاق، إلا إذا عمل ذات الغلطة وعمل كومينجلينج، يعني مزج الشيء اللي كان عنده قبل الزواج بالماريتال اكاونت تبعه. يعني مثلا نعطي أجان، نقول إنسان عنده شقة وشارية قبل الزواج، وحتى شقة إن كان هون أو بلبنان أو anywhere else، إذا استعمل ضمن الزواج، وهيدي بتصير كل ما طال الزواج كل ما بيصير من هيدا السلوك، والإنسان ما بيفكر. أول شيء ما حدا بيفكر بالطلاق، وثانيا مع مرور الوقت كل ما طال الزواج كل ما في نسبة أكتر إنه هذا الإنسان إن كان ورثة حصل عليها أو إن كان أشياء كانت عنده قبل الزواج يبلش يعمل خليط بينه وبين الماريتال اكاونت تبعه، وهون بيصير الخطر. هون الحصانة اللي عنده إياها بيخسرها، الحصانة اللي بتقول إنه اللي جابه للزواج بيظهر من الزواج فيه، أو الحصانة اللي بتقول إنه شو ورث هو له 100%. كمان مرة اللي بيورث أو اللي بيجي للزواج وعنده إن كان مصاري أو بروبرتي، إذا ما مزجها بالماريتال أكاونت تبعه، هذا الشخص بيحصل عليها 100% بحال صار طلاق. بس إذا مزجها مثل اللي عنده شقة، من بعد ما صار عنده شقة قرر يبعت مصاري من هون أو يستعمل مصاري من الماريتال اكاونت تبعه لحتى يجدد الشقه، ليعمل لها امبروفمنت، ليبيع جزء منها، ليعمل لها ريفاينانسينج، هون صار في مزيج، هون صار في بسموه بالانجليزي كومينجلينج. هون الحصانه اللي كان عنده هذا الانسان بيخسرها. سو هيدا النقطه اللي نحن عم نحاول نوصلها. حكينا كمان عن شغلتين اللي هي بتقول انه حتى بحال الطلاق، إذا كان الإنسان عنده أراضي بغير بلد، إن كانت الفلبين مثل ما ذكرت لنا أو إن كانت العراق أو إن كانت لبنان، إذا صار في مزيج، إذا اشتراها الإنسان ضمن الزواج، النص له والنص للطرف الآخر. وإذا اشتراها قبل الزواج ذات الشيء، إذا خلطها بيخسر الحصانة، إذا ما خلطها بترجع له. لنقول شرية قبل وخلطها حصر حصانته، أو لنقول اشترى أرض، مثل في كتير عالم عم بيتسمعوا علينا مجوزين لهم 15 سنة مجوزين واشتروا أرض بلبنان. القاضي هون بيقدر يأمر على الأرض بلبنان، القاضي هون بيقدر يطلع أمر على الأرض بلبنان مع أنه الأرض موجودة بلبنان. المحكمة بلبنان منا مضطرة تطبق هذا الأمر، بس القاضي هون إذا أثبتنا له أنه الأمر اللي مفروض يتطبق ما عم يلتزم فيه الطرف الآخر، لنقول القاضي هون أمر الرجل أنه يبيع الأرض بلبنان، والرجل لأسباب أو لأخرى dragged his heels مثل ما بيقولوا وما دفع المصاري، وقدرنا أثبتنا للقاضي هون اللي أمر الشخص هون أنه يبيع الأرض بلبنان ويعطي النص للزوجة، إذا قدرنا أثبتنا أنه بالفعل هذا الإنسان عم يتصرف قصد، ساعتها القاضي هون بيقدر يطلب من المرأة أنه تجيب محلف يتمن الأرض بلبنان، ونقدم تأتمين الأرض للقاضي هون بولاية ميشيغان أو بأمريكا. القاضي هون بيأمر الشخص الثاني أنه يدفع قيمتها بالنص، وإذا ما دفعها بيكون في سانكشنز. يعني ليك قديه عنده القاضي قدرة يطال أراضي هي بخارج الولايات المتحدة أو خارج الولاية. والنقطة الثانية هي كمان أنه ممكن يكون في أمر بغير بلد، وإذا صار في طلاق بهيدا البلد، إذا قنعنا القاضي أنه هذا الأمر بالبلد الآخر هو منصف، القاضي بيقدر يضيفوا على الأمر هون وبيصير كأنه أمر هون. يعني بعرف شوي معقدة، بس حبينا نحكي شوي أكثر بهذا الموضوع. عنا دقيقتين رح أطلب منها تخبرنا بطريقة سريعة عن الموكل العراقي اللي كان عنده كمان ممتلكات بكندا. Attorney Maria Panchenko, we have less than 2 minutes. Can you tell us about the Iraqi client?
We had a client a while back that had had property just like we discussed before, this that he owned before he was married. But then after he was married, he later on in life, during the marriage, sold the home, or I'm sorry, excuse me, refinanced the home and took
So
the
he
money.
commingled it.
Yes, he refinanced the home and took the money from the refinance to improve the home he was living in with his spouse. And when later on, the home, or excuse me, the parties decided to divorce.
Where was the property before the
The
marriage? In Canada?
there was properties in Canada, and then there was properties in the States. And you're taking money from when you're taking money from property.
1 minute, Maria, if you don't mind.
Yes, when you're taking money from property that was separate and putting it into your marital estate, you've commingled it.
So what did the judge order?
In this case specifically, there was a settlement, but it would have been ordered that the properties would all be sold and split. They were able to settle the case out.
Half to him and half to his wife. Thank you so much, Attorney Maria Panchenko. We very much appreciate this valuable information. We're talking about medical malpractice tomorrow with Attorney Jay Yasso. الأخطاء الطبية بكرة. Thank you very much to all of our listeners. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Maria.